Between July 1997 and October 2006, 23 young men would fall prey to a vicious serial killer in Louisiana. After luring them into his home, he would attack them and tie them up before abusing them and strangling them to death. Once he was done, he loaded their bodies into the back of his truck and dumped them off in secluded areas. Ronald Dominique, the Bayou Strangler. Ronald Dominique was born in 1964. His family was poor and lived in a trailer park in Thibodaux, Louisiana. While in school, Ronald had a variety of issues, such as low self-esteem, a lack of communication skills, and issues with his weight. As a result, he was bullied and harassed, and things got even worse when he realized he was gay. Classmates saw him outside a local gay bar, and the bullying he faced took on a new angle. One of the few things he enjoyed was singing, and later he would dress up and sing as Patti LaBelle at the local gay bars. Dominique graduated from Thibodaux High School in 1983, then went on to study computer science at the junior college in town, but never got a degree. For much of his life, Dominique was known by his friends and neighbors as a friendly and generous person. He often helped with yard work and other chores for those in his neighborhood. During this time, he never came out to acquaintances in his community. However, he spent his nights in gay bars and performing in drag. Interestingly, while his neighbors had a positive attitude toward Dominique, those in the bars and gay community saw him as off-putting and strange. He had the nickname of Miss Moped due to the motorized scooter he traveled on. Perhaps due to his inability to form real relationships, the cool and friendly exterior began to falter and his criminal record began to grow. The first crime on record for Ronald Dominique occurred on June 12, 1985. He was arrested and given a $75 fine for sexual harassment. During this time, he was primarily living off relatives, and when he did work, it was in low-skill positions. Dominique lived quietly in this manner, bouncing between his mother and sister's house for nearly a decade until 1994. In May, Dominique was arrested for drunk driving and was forced to pay another fine in lieu of a harsher punishment. But the appearance of a normal and quiet life really broke down on August 25, 1996. A half-dressed young man leapt from a window of Dominique's sister's house. He told neighbors and police that Ronald had tried to assault and murder him. After he was arrested, bail was set at $100,000, and it seemed as if nothing could save Dominique from prison. However, when the prosecutor tried to build out the case, they were unable to find or even identify the victim. This led to the case being dismissed and Dominique's release in October of 1996. In February of 2002, Dominique was arrested for another attack. During Mardi Gras festivities in Terrebonne Parish, he punched a woman in the face. The two had an altercation after Dominique confronted her over her driving. But again, he was able to squirm away from any real consequences. The charges were dropped after Ronald apologized to the woman, and they were able to reach an agreement of reconciliation outside of court. At this point, he had already been a murderer for at least 5 years. The first known murder of Ronald Dominique occurred on July 12, 1997. David Mitchell was a 19-year-old man who was hitchhiking home after celebrating the birthday of a relative at his grandmother's house when he disappeared. His body was found on July 14th, face down in a ditch along the highway. Water from the ditch was found inside his lungs, which pointed to him drowning. However, the lack of alcohol or drugs in his system made this seem unlikely, in addition to the fact that his pants had been pulled down to his ankles. Even so, the death would be considered an accidental drowning until the killer confessed in custody years later. The second known victim was murdered in December of 1997. 20-year-old Gary Pierre was a troubled young man with a criminal record for drug offenses. He was likely lured into Dominique's control with drugs or money. When his body was found, there was no physical trauma and he was fully clothed. The lack of trauma makes it likely that Pierre was asphyxiated. The next victim lost his life to Ronald Dominique on July 31st, 1998. Larry Ranson was a 38-year-old who had fallen on hard times. He was homeless and addicted to drugs. Dominique took advantage of this, and Ranson's body was found soon after. The killer found his next victim in a bar. 27-year-old Oliver Lebanks was at a gay bar called Rawhide on October 3, 1998. He was also down on his luck and was known to prostitute himself in addition to petty crimes to make money after losing his job due to drug use. Lebanks and Dominique negotiated an exchange of money for adult services, then left the bar to complete the deal in the killer's car. Once the deed was complete, Dominique attacked. After 2 blows to the head with a tire iron, Lebanks was unconscious with 2 concussions. The depraved killer removed his belt and began to strangle the young man before eventually switching to his hands. Once he was done, Dominique dumped Lebanks' body by the side of Highway 61, where he was found the next morning with his pants around his ankles. The next victim would be the youngest to fall prey to the vicious killer. Joseph Brown was only 16 when he was murdered by Dominique. It was October 1998, the same month that Lebanks was killed, and Ronald was on the prowl for another victim. He approached Joseph Brown in Jenner, Louisiana, and offered him some crack cocaine. The two went to the killer's truck and smoked the drugs. Once they had finished, and before Brown could escape, Dominique beat him, then suffocated him to death with a plastic bag, before dumping his lifeless body. The killings were happening rapidly, and less than a month after the murder of Brown, Dominique struck again. 18-year-old Bruce Williams lost his life to the depraved monster in November of 1998 in Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. There was a brief pause before the killer struck again in May of 1999. Dominique was cruising for a victim when Manuel Reed approached him and asked him if he wanted to buy some drugs. Once he climbed into the monster's truck, Dominique attacked him, assaulting him before strangling him and putting his body in a dumpster. The dump site was only a mile away from where he had disposed of Joseph Brown's body only a few months prior. A homeless man named Angel Mejia was the next victim of the vicious monster. The 34-year-old lost his life to Dominique in June of 1999. The killer went to leave his corpse in a dumpster, but when he found it was full, he discarded his victim's remains on the side of the road. Investigators were beginning to recognize that a serial killer was operating in the area. When the coroner examined Mejia's body, it was discovered that he had been tied up before his death. The bodies were piling up, and police were collecting DNA evidence left behind by the killer, as well as the evidence of bondage. In August of 1999, Dominique murdered a 34-year-old named Mitchell Johnson. He had made a deal with him to exchange drugs for an adult favor, and the two went off into the woods together near Metairie, Louisiana. Once away from witnesses, Dominique tied Johnson up and assaulted him before strangling him to death. His body was found soon after, completely naked, on September 1st. The police were building their case and had compiled quite a bit of evidence on the killer they sought. When they released a composite sketch of the perpetrator, Dominique began to worry that he would be caught. He quit his job and moved in with his sister in November of 1999 and began working as a pizza delivery boy. But the monster could not restrain himself, and soon enough, he was trolling for victims once again. Michael Vincent was 23 years old when he fell prey to Dominique in January of 2000. The murders were more spread out than they had been before, but Dominique was unable to stop himself from killing. In October of 2000, Dominique became acquainted with a 20-year-old named Kenneth Randolph Jr. Randolph had been charged multiple times for child molestation. Dominique lured Randolph into his trailer with the promise that a girl was waiting for him inside. Once they were alone, he attacked and murdered the young man. Afterward, Dominique stuck the body out and dumped him in a field where it would be found partially nude on October 6. More than 2 years would pass before the killer would strike again. In 2002, on October 12th, Dominique was once again luring another victim into his grasp. 26-year-old Anoka Jones was a cash-strapped, petty criminal who the killer approached on the streets of Houma, Louisiana. Dominique tied Jones up before assaulting and strangling him. He dumped Jones' remains under a freeway overpass. This time, it was only hours before the body was discovered and added to the list of unsolved murders in the area. Later that year, Dominique moved with his sister to the rural community known as Bayou Blue. He also began working for an electrical company, which was a step up from his previous job delivering pizza. The next victim was a 19-year-old named Datrell Woods. He took the young man and his bicycle off the street and murdered him in late 2002. After what had become a routine of assault and strangulation, Dominique dumped the teen's remains in a field where it would remain undiscovered until May of 2003. The death of Woods was marked down as due to natural causes initially. This was because he was known to suffer from asthma, and the cause of death was asphyxiation. Once Dominique was arrested, this changed. 2 years after the murder of Woods, in October of 2004, the monster lured a 46-year-old homeless man named Larry Matthews to his home. They had agreed to share some drugs, and when Matthew lost consciousness after ingesting the drugs, Dominique assaulted and strangled him. Due to his transient lifestyle, it was a while before Matthew's disappearance was noticed, and by the time his body was recovered, it could only be identified by his fingerprints. Another murder would take place that October. The body of 21-year-old Michael Barnett was found on the 24th. He was the first white victim of Ronald Dominique. The previous victims had all been black men. 4 months later, in February of 2005, Dominique murdered again. The victim was 22-year-old Lirett. This killing ended the police suspicion that he had been the killer of Anoka Jones, who had been his roommate along with Michael Barnett. He had been the last to see Jones alive, but when his body was found, the investigation hit a dead end. In April 2005, the creature lured a 31-year-old homeless man to his home with the promise of a place to stay. Once he had 31-year-old August Watkins in his power, Dominique plied him with alcohol. Once he was able to overpower Watkins, he tied him up, abused him, then strangled him. At this point, the police were truly starting to grasp just how prolific the serial killer they were hunting was. The method of murder and abuse was consistent among a growing number of bodies that were turning up. This led to the evidence and investigation being shared with the FBI. Within days of killing Watkins, Dominique murdered a 23-year-old named Cunningham. This was in April, and then in July, he murdered 20-year-old Alonzo Hogan. He had used the ruse that he had a female friend who was interested in the men. He used this same scheme before and would use it again in August of 2005. 17-year-old Wayne Smith did not have a criminal record or history of drug abuse like many of the previous victims, and the same could be said for Alonzo Hogan. Smith's body was found floating in a canal, and the water had washed away any traces of the killer, as well as accelerated the decomposition. In late August, Hurricane Katrina destroyed much of Louisiana, but it did not stop Dominique from continuing to kill. Among the devastation, 40-year-old Chris Deville was trying to hitchhike out of the state. After killing him, Dominique dumped his body in a field where he would be found a month later. Deville was identified by his ID cards and personal belongings that lay scattered around his corpse. 21-year-old Nicholas Pelegrin was killed in November of 2005. Pelegrin had been involved with some drug dealers and had failed to pay a debt. His family reported that he had been receiving death threats, and so his murder was attributed to the drug dealers until Dominique was in custody. The last victim was in a relationship briefly with Dominique before he was killed. 27-year-old Christopher Sutterfield met the killer over the summer of 2006, and they began dating. October had been a violent month for Dominique in prior years, and 2006 was no different. On the 14th, he beat Sutterfield unconscious, then killed him. A month later, things began to unravel for Dominique. A man named Ricky Wallace reported to police that the killer had lured him into his trailer with the promise of female company. Then, Dominique told him that the girl enjoyed bondage and tried to tie him up, but Wallace refused and narrowly escaped. When Dominique was brought in for questioning, he was almost able to talk his way out of suspicion, but the police got a blood sample before he left, and the DNA came back as a match to that left behind on many of the victims, and Dominique was arrested. He said he knew that arrest was imminent, and so he had moved out of his sister's house to avoid her being inconvenienced, which resulted in his arrest taking place in a homeless shelter. Once in custody, Dominique readily confessed to his crimes, but he had excuses prepared for the murders which fell on deaf ears. He claimed that his victims had tried to force themselves on him, or that he feared they were going to rob him and had acted in self-defense. But this broke down under questioning, and he admitted that he simply did not want them going to police. The killer accepted a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty. On the 24th of September 2008, Dominique was sentenced to multiple life terms without the chance for parole. He is currently housed at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola.